Today we're going to talk about ribbing. This is knit 2 purl 2 ribbing. It's super stretchy. Knit 1 purl 1 ribbing. It's also very stretchy. Both of these are used for the edge of garments or hats or socks or anything where you want to keep your item snug at the edge. So if you look at the difference between the two, one is a little closer than the other. This one tends to be a little stretchier. If you look at them on the swatch, you see how they draw in, which is what helps to keep your hat on or helps to keep your sweater secure at your cuff. So first we're going to talk a little bit about how and why ribbing works. So one, it looks beautiful on the edge of a garment. Here it is on the neck edge of this really, really pretty, nicely done poncho. Not only does it draw the neck in a beautiful way, it also keeps you from having issues with your garment later. So say this is her cast on edge. So say there was a hole in this and the yarn broke. Well, we'd be afraid that the ribbing was going to run like, old nylon stockings. But if you break the edge, cast on edge of ribbing, the ribbing doesn't really go anywhere because the stitches are not constructed in that direction. So it works really well in a cuff for maybe like a little kid that's going to be rough on their work. On the other hand, if you're making an adult sweater that you know is going to get a lot of wear, and you want to be able to fix that ribbing, it's kind of better to do a sleeve from the top down so your bind off edge is on the cuff. Then you can just simply remove the bind off and put on new ribbing. So there's ribbing in this hat. This is a twisted rib. You see how it draws the hat in, sort of muffin shaped. I love this yarn. It has this beautiful neon fleck that I can't even tell you how happy it makes me. But this is a nice little hat. The edge stretches. It'll keep on your head. Now, ribbing consists of knits and purls. So knit 1 purl 1 ribbing, or 1x1 ribbing, is done by doing a knit stitch and a purl stitch, one right after another. One of the mistakes my students make in doing this is they pull their yarn over the top of the needle. You need to pull your yarn between your needles when you change from knits to purls, between your needles. When you do that, I had a little twisted stitch there, between the needles to the front, between the needles to the back, between the needles to the front for a purl, between the needles to the back for a purl, a knit. What that does, it keeps you from having yarn overs in your ribbing, and it keeps you from having holes and from adding stitches and from just giving yourself a big mess to deal with. So it's really important whenever you change stitches to go between the needles and bring your yarn forward or bring your yarn back. So I'll show you what it looks like if you don't. Here we had a purl stitch, we have a knit stitch. See that? We have an extra stitch in there from pulling the yarn over. That is not going to help you. It's going to make a big hole. It's going to be a problem for you. So simply be sure that you go between your needles for knits and purls. So here, when you're making ribbing, like on the edge of a hat or a sweater, wherever you're doing it, you want to do repeats, multiples of a stitch. That is very confusing. So a repeat in knit 1 purl 1 ribbing would be 2 stitches, a knit stitch and a purl stitch. Knit stitch, purl stitch. Here's the next 2, knit stitch, purl stitch. So 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. What that does is when you join it in the round, you don't have any extra stitches and you don't have too few. Also, when you do a seam, When you're seaming, you're going to seam one stitch off each edge. See that? Now you have a knit and a purl together. When you turn your work and you're knitting back, you'll see that you have columns of knits and columns of purls. Actually, it's whether you turn or not. The knits will be a flat presentation, and the purls will have this little purl bump. I'm going back to my continental. It's my go-to kind of knitting. Knit stitch is flat, purl stitch is bump. So another common mistake my customers do is that they go, oh, I'm supposed to be doing knit one, purl one, and they make a mistake and knit a purl, and then they continue in that fashion, and all of the straight lines on their ribbing is confused. Not a good choice. So you want to be able to read your knitting for the knits and the purls. So if you do make a mistake, you can quickly correct them and quit having, without making a bigger problem. So now we're going to talk a little bit about 2x2 ribbing. Here's our 2x2 ribbing. You know, it's just like with our 1x1 ribbing. We started with a knit and we ended with a purl, which is great. But if we were to do a seam, we take one stitch from this side and one stitch from that side, and we'd have one knit and one purl together. That would be a problem because it would interfere with the edge of our garment. So when you're seaming a knit 2 purl 2 garment, or you're planning that out, you need to have a multiple of 4. So knit 2, purl 2, that's 4. And then you add 2 more stitches, knit 2, so that when you do your seam, you have knits on both sides. And you see, you can, when you put those together, there will be a nice seam of 2 knits together. So your ribbing will show evenly all the way around. Now, knit 2, purl 2 ribbing also can be more obvious if you have something where your stitches are a little bit distorted. You can see a little bit of distortion here. And that's because when you travel from your knit stitch to your purl stitch, it can gain a little bit of yardage in there, just a little tiny bit of fabric. It's so little and insignificant, you probably wouldn't even see it just as a regular knitter. But when you're looking at a finished garment, you can see it. So when we're going to do our knit 2, purl 2 ribbing, we're going to do, here's our knit 1, knit 2, bring our yarn forward for the purl. We're just going to snug that up a tiny bit. Just going to have a little bit of a pull. Now we're going to go back to our knit. And you actually snug up a stitch after the stitch is made. It seems like that's a weird thing, but just how it works. Yarn runs backwards. And as you look at this, see how my yarn is on the needle. If I pulled before it was on the needle, it probably wouldn't do us any good. It'd just be fixing the stitch behind. So you always want to do any kind of tightening after you knit the stitch, not before. Because otherwise you'll just end up with a tighter stitch before, and that's kind of a problem. Now, we've done this with throwing, which a lot of you do. I'm going to do with my continental. I just purl those first 2 stitches with the first stitch with a little bit of a tug. And it will straighten all my ribbing out nicely. So let's try that again. Knit 1, 2, yarn forward, give it a little tug, pull, purl, purl. Knit 1, 2, purl the stitch, give it a little tug, purl, knit, knit, purl with a little tug, purl, knit, knit, purl, a little tug, purl, knit, knit, purl, purl. There you go. I hope you can see the difference between the two. There's 2 little bumps there, and our knits have become even wider. I'm going to race through a row really quick so you can see it a little bit more. The difference when they're right next to each other. And yes, I really knit this at this rate. But I can't type quickly, accurately. Just who knows why. So there you go. And you can see the difference. See how we have our columns have changed. You can also see here, this is a purl column, and it changes to the knit there. And you see how this column here changes to a purl. So if you were to be somebody who's just making a mistake in their ribbing, you'd suddenly have your knit and purl columns all kind of crazy. So you want to be able to really, really read your knitting. Knits are smooth on top, purls are tight, or have a little collar around the needle. And that's your lesson for today. Have a great day. Bye.